just yeah. Okay.
I'm gonna let you tell all the
You too. Yeah, they're starting to run that business for sure. So there's actually got by CPID, that's the venture from Permian. So it works pretty good. They midstream, we the ground, and yes.
He would actually say, oh yeah, here's what we did yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did.
Test, test, one.
Okay, where are you?
I'm out of Calgary. We have just
I used to represent the state of Alaska in Canada.
Oh yeah.
And oil gas. And I love that. Well, I'd be there in this presentation. I would say I represented oil gas. It was back when it's back when
Oh, okay.
and I don't have a car, but I
It's not very loud. Okay. Oh, you did? Oh, okay.
I left Arco.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Ready to go.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
That's it? I see. Okay. If you do it, I actually enjoyed the detector. Good exposure to the U.S. politics. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Sorry.
Good sponsor.
Hey, here's one.
You're right. Well, it doesn't work out. Roger doesn't have a timer.
Yeah, so you did it wrong.
Yeah, I saw it, they interrupted it, really got funny.
Well, if I feel free, if I don't.
All right, we're going to get started. And shorthand? Rusty is a shorthand.
Say what?
Is this shorthand? You write like that.
No.
I'm impressed.
You're you can't read it, can you?
I can't read it, no. But you can, right?
I think.
All right, I wanna thank somebody here. You're drinking compliments and eating compliments of Linnell Honeyman and Honeyman Exploration right here. Give her a hand. Yeah, bless her heart, we were at a committee meeting 2 months ago, and we were saying, you know, we may have enough crowd to have 2 receptions. And the committee voted for it, and I said, I don't know how we're gonna pay for it. And she said, well, maybe I can help. So she did. Bless her heart. She didn't expect this many, so she hadn't seen the bill yet. Today was about 140, I think, and we were expecting 120 max. And I had a lot of sign-ups walk up today too, and a lot signed up for tomorrow. I think tomorrow's going to be bigger, actually. So 25 last year. Yeah, this is a whole different world. All right, some of you might know this fellow with the beard back there, but Rusty is a jack of all trades. I like to find people that can connect dots, you know, and get out of the silo, and a bunch of you in here like that, and you're getting a broad touch of CO2, you know, all the way from EOR to capture to transport to you name it, now trading credits. And so there's a guy that has is it a blog? Is it really a blog? What do you call that? Blog, okay. And it comes every Monday and maybe sometimes on Wednesday, and it is just full of factual information. He's going to tell you a little bit about all of that, but mostly he's going to bring a little fun into it. And Rusty Braziel has got a history in the oil and gas business, as you might guess. He had 20 years with Texaco, and then he went and formed a company that he sold out. Might have made $1 or $2 on that, I bet. Yeah, and then got in and has been in the trading business a bit, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about what he's doing now, which is pretty fascinating. And when he heard we were doing a conference, he said, hey, you know, I might ought to come to that. I was afraid what he's going to say was going to cost us $20,000 for him to speak, but he graciously came. So come up here, Rusty, and we're looking forward to having you entertain us.
Hey, Steve and Mike, thanks a lot for asking me to be here. Notice that I'm the only speaker that they require that I only speak after you have alcohol. There's a reason for that. You know, before I get started on this, I thought it'd be a good idea just to kind of tell you a little bit about what it is that I do and what I'm doing here. I'm an energy markets guy. I spent the majority of my career trading energy commodities, crude oil, natural gas liquids. Did that with Texaco and also worked with Williams for a number of years. And after that, I started that company that Steve talked about and sold it off, and started this company right at 10 years ago. It's called RBN Energy. And what we do is energy market analytics, which means we crunch a bunch of numbers and then sell those numbers to our clients. And we also do a lot of consulting. Most of the consulting that we do is like due diligence, market assessments, trying to figure out what's going on in markets. And since it's my background and we've got about 40 people in the company, we do analysis around crude oil, gas, and natural gas liquids. Well, starting about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, we started getting calls from folks that wanted us to look at CO2 and hydrogen. And we said, we don't know anything about CO2 and hydrogen. You got to go to ask somebody else. And they said, well, we've asked everybody else. We looked at the internet. There's a lot of technical information on the internet, most of it Steve's. but there's not a lot of market information like flows and capacities, and prices. And so we had one client came in, one of our best clients, came in and said, you know, we really want you to do this project and look at CO2 across the United States, really focus in on the Permian. And we gave the same spiel, and they said, well, if you do it, we'll make it worth your while. And so, you know, that was last year, and going into this year, we could use the business, so we said, yeah. So we signed up and started to do some work. So I needed to find somebody that really knew what was going on. Yesterday, I don't know if yesterday, today, this morning, Mike kind of had an offhand remark that says, hey, I've known this guy since 1982. Well, I've known Mike since 1982, and the reason why is because we worked on a project together in order to create something called Crude Oil Futures. We were both on a committee to create Crude Oil Futures. I was with Getty Oil Company at the time in Los Angeles. We got together and everybody said there's no way in the world that this project is ever going to get off the ground. Well, of course it did, and now it's one of the most active trading contracts in the world. And so I knew that Mike had been involved in CO2 all these years, so he's the first person I picked up the phone and called. He started to introduce me around, and he says, the guy that you really need to talk to is Yoda. Everybody knows who Yoda is, right? He's sitting right there. And we started talking to Yoda, and we learned a lot about CO2 and talked to a lot of other folks too. So, you know, after doing all that number crunching and doing the project for these guys, the thing that I came away with was that, gosh, there's something that's not getting across here. This is a great story. We've got a lot of things that are trying to happen with CO2 and clean air and all of this, and somehow or another, it just didn't seem to me that the story was really getting across in the right way. So that's the reason when Steve asked me to do this thing, for one thing, he did a conference for me about 3 months ago, so this is kind of tit for tat. But also, I thought, well, I always try to do some sort of rock and roll theme song, and it seemed appropriate that the title for this thing ought to be I Can't Get No Sequestration. And of course it's takeoff from the Stones song. And if you want to see what Steve and Mike looked like when they first started putting this thing on, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to say. The question was, which one is Steve? So kind of coming away with that conclusions, I thought that maybe what we'd do is kind of go through one scenario or one piece of the marketplace that would get you a sense about kind of the way a newbie like myself, who hasn't been in this for a little over a year, but with an awful lot of experience in markets, looks at things. So that's what I thought we'd start with. How about that? How would the environment, how would the industry, and how would individual Permian players benefit if natural CO2 that is used in the Permian right now were to get replaced with anthropogenic CO2? Bottom line, it would be a pretty big deal. By replacing natural CO2 with anthropogenic, today's EOR fields could sequester about 15% of industrial emissions needed to keep the temperature rise below the 2 degree, not 1.5, but the 2 degree Celsius threshold. And that's just with the CO2 sequestration that exists today. Not any of that we heard about this morning, where we could add lots and lots of additional CO2 sequestration capacity. That's just with what we have today. There is more than enough CO2 to be able to accomplish that along the Houston Ship Channel. Replacing the CO2 with free anthropogenic, and I'll talk about what I mean by free in a second. Permian producers could improve their revenues by somewhere around $4 to $10 a barrel by eliminating those natural CO2 purchases. In that case, the emitter would get the 35 bucks a ton. Maybe it turns out to be 60 bucks a ton if the BBB thing happens the way that we heard about today. And that would justify, at least by our numbers, and not exactly the same numbers that we looked at today from one of the presenters, but most ethanol, most ammonia, most, not all natural gas processing, and most hydrogen. Would not support refineries, wouldn't support a lot of chemical companies, but these are big companies and they may be perfectly willing to sequester and pay for more for their sequestration than they're actually going to get out of it just in order to meet their ESG goals. So, you know, what's the issue with all of this? Well, is anybody building this pipeline right now? And the answer is no, nobody's building that pipeline. And that's kind of a shame, because the world is focused, as we've heard all day today, on the reduction of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the #1 greenhouse gas. Commitments are being made, bills are being spent on that, and one of the best stories for getting that done is right here in the Permian with CCUS EOR, and somehow it seems to me that CCUS EOR has a marketing problem. We heard one of the speakers today, what was his statement? We don't hear much about the U anymore. That's a problem. That's a problem for a lot of folks here in this room. And therefore, I think we ought to figure out, is there anything that we can do to rethink the way we try to get the message out? So, in order to make sense out of this, I got to get it down, as we say in East Texas. I'm from a place called Lindale, Texas, down to where the cows can eat it. So I can't understand grams. I can't understand most of the units that were talked about today. I got to get something into some units that I understand. So we're going to go through a little bit of that and talk about the magnitude of the problem and then what the solution to that problem might be. So if you look at all the government data out there, you look at the global emissions, it's about 50 gigatons. 16% of that is methane, 8% of that's nitrous oxide, 1% other miscellaneous stuff. 65% is greenhouse gases that are produced by countries other than the United States, and greenhouse gases that are other than CO2 in the United States. That's 65% slice, and that leaves 10%, which is the CO2 that's produced in the United States, around 5 gigatons or so. That metric means absolutely nothing to an energy markets guy. So to make it a little bit more familiar, let's convert it into BCF a day. I can understand BCF a days. That's 265 of them. That's a lot of gas. If we just focus on that 265, we compare it to the natural gas production in the United States each day. That's about 95 BCF, a little more than that right now. It's been kind of bumping up the last couple of weeks. 95 BCF a day. And that means that the U.S. produces 2.8 times as much CO2 as the U.S. produces natural gas every day from every basin in the country. That's a lot of CO2. Now I can understand the magnitude of the problem. So, what do you do about a magnitude of a problem like that? Well, first of all, you carve it up to try to figure out what you can really focus on. And this is that same 5 gigatons of emissions, 36% transportation, cars and trucks, 32% power generation, 19% residential, commercial, and other. And most of that CO2 is already in the crosshairs on the transportation side. That's what the Teslas of the world are after. In the power sector, it's all about what's going on with wind and solar. And that points us to, obviously, the industrial sector, what's left. That's 16% or so. The 16% works out to be 0.8 gigatons. It sounds like a small number, not when you convert it to BCF a day. It's 45 BCF a day. But the good news is we don't have to eliminate all of that to have a pretty decent sized impact. All we need to do, if we're focused on the 2% Celsius number, and whether or not the 1.5 is ever going to happen or not, I think it's an open question, but all we need to do is hit about 25% reduction in total emissions, and we can take that 25% and just take it pro rata across all those sectors and say we can solve 25% of that issue with 11 BCF or so. You know, if we look then at how much makeup CO2 there is out there right now, we think that works out to be about 1.7 BCF. So that's where I get my 15%, about we can take care of 15% just using no more than the sequestration capacity that is being used right now today as we sit here, except it's natural CO2 going into it rather than anthropogenic. So if we were to replace CO2 natural with anthropogenic, how much are we talking about? Where do the numbers come from? Where does that 1.7 come from? Well, you know, everybody in the room knows it comes from primarily 4 major fields. First, McElmo and No Canyon, I guess. Kinder, southwestern Colorado. We guess that it's about 710 million a day. There's people in this room, I'm sure, who will correct me. If you need to correct me, please do. We think that's down about 400 since 2019, so in other words, a lot less. But we also understand that there's enough CO2 at Mount Galmo will last another 20 years or so, if there's demand for it for another 20 years or so. Bravo, second largest, about 190,000 barrels a day, 190 million a day, 190 million cubic feet a day, down about 30% over the last 5 years. We understand that that's probably only going to last another 5+ years or so. But it's going to take some money to rejuvenate the field in order to be able to get much beyond that. Sheep Mountain, we were thinking it was shut down. I understand, talking to some folks today, that it just recently been cranked back up, still fairly small volumes. And then there's Jackson Dome over in Mississippi. This is Denbury field serving the Gulf Coast. That's about 500 million a day, but 80%, only 80% of that is actually going into the CO2 operation. About 20% of that is going to the industrial companies. Add that to the other natural CO2 that's been used in the marketplace, and we think that gets us to about that 1.7 BCF a day, meaning that newly injected CO2, including recycled, so excluding recycled. And so that's the volume that we think could be replaced with anthropogenic without doing anything else, with adding any sort of capacity that doesn't already exist. So if you buy those numbers or buy anything close to those numbers, the next thing we wanted to do is try to figure out, well, exactly where does all this stuff need to go. So what we did is we put together a map, basically trying to lay out all the pipelines, the capacities on those pipelines, all the sources of the CO2, where it basically comes from. So, just to give you a sense of it, at the Permian, the CO2 from Doe Canyon, McElmo is coming down from Colorado on Cortez pipeline. It's about a 1.6, 1.5 BCF pipeline. That's the green line that you see there. And then moving over and south, that's the Bravo Dome out of New Mexico, linked in with the Bravo pipeline, about 380 million a day on that one. In addition to all the long haul pipes, lots of other pipes in the area. We got that little insert that shows that. Next up is the Gulf Coast. This is the Denbury system. It includes the, there we go, Denbury system that includes Jackson Dome, several industrial facilities. Some of them they've already got connected in, others that they're working on, and of course 16 fields that they've also got there. Denbury is also a big player up in the Rockies, like we just saw this afternoon, with Glencore pipeline, Green Core pipeline in Wyoming, extending all the way up into Montana and now North Dakota, as we just heard. And then there's a lot of standalone pipeline systems in the mid-continent, mostly small EOR operations. And then, although it's not EOR, we can't forget about a couple of big projects that are going on up in the Midwest. the 1,200-mile pipeline being developed by Navigator, which will transport CO2 at 8 Valero ethanol plants to a sequestration site in Illinois, and then the Summit Energy Partners facility, 710-mile Midwest Carbon Express that's being developed to capture CO2 from ethanol plants in the Midwest. And there's a bunch of other projects that we've got there as well. We had to learn things that we've heard about all day today, and we'll hear about more tomorrow, so I'm just going to skip past this really quickly, but it's differences between the CCS and the CCUS. Again, the whole issue that we're trying to get our heads around is what's the problem with the U? And one issue is the pore space. We've heard about that. I think you've got another one on that tomorrow sometime. That if it's EOR, the mineral rights owner owns the pore space. If it's CCS, then it's the surface rights owner. Natural gas guys, storage guys have been dealing with this issue for years, so it's not a big deal, but nevertheless, it's not the kind of thing that a lot of companies, E&P companies, are all that used to. So, the pore space issues for EORs, where we're concerned, still have a lot of advantages versus CCS. Second issue is the thing about disposal wells, class 2 versus class 6, at least as we understand it. Only 2 class 6s are actually flowing right now. Several more in the process of getting permitted, but these things obviously must be a real pain. Third issue, tax credits, 45 Qs, $35 versus $50, maybe $80 or $60 up to $80 if the BBB thinks it actually happens that way. And probably one of the things that we wanted to at least think about was the fact that, in terms of these issues, we got a really powerful signal about how Exxon is thinking about it when they announced their $100 billion innovation zone project for the Houston Ship Channel and CCS. It avoids the optics of producing oil from EOR, and there's only one pore rights owner to deal with. So I'm sure there's lots of other good reasons to put this stuff out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico instead of in the Permian, but I don't know what it would be. You're going to spend many millions of dollars to make it happen. So that gets us to the point of where all that anthropogenic CO2 ought to go, and of course I've already got the other thing that ought to be right here in the Permian Basin. So to understand that, we need to put together a map of this. There's several other versions of maps that we used as a basis for this. And we also calculated the relative rankings of the major CO2 flood fields in order to be able to just get a sense of what the economics were. And at $65, $75 a barrel, all the EOR fields are looking a lot better than they did last year. But there's big differences from one field to the next. So for those of you who are involved, here's kind of how we come up with the pecking order. We think that Sacroft, Seminole, where we were yesterday's great tour, thank you, Steve, and Hobbs are probably the economically the best. Wasson and Dublin Slaughter are probably on the other end of the spectrum, and Vacuum and Yates probably somewhere in the middle. And we're doing a lot of work to try to tune up what we think those numbers. The size of the bubbles, by the way, are basically the size of the crude oil that are produced in each one of those basins. So to give you a sense about the way we think about this, I thought you might like to look at the way we calculate a EOR balancing model for the Permian. And this is the Permian Basin as a whole. Total CO2 in, hydrocarbons out. So it's a gross generalization, but I think I'll give you a good way to think about it. So obviously, center of the universe is the Permian field itself, or the Permian Basin itself. First, our supply of CO2. Again, we're guessing about 710 coming in from McElmo, about 190 coming in from Bravo, about another 150 coming in from other places. So that ends up to be about 1,050 million a day coming in as make-up CO2 to the basin. Out of that, we estimate that we're producing about 170,000 barrels a day. That number might be low, but that was our best guess looking at the statistics that come out of a company called Veris, used to be called Drilling Info, trying to figure out exactly what production is. So if you believe that 170 and you believe that 1050, just divide one number by the other, and that gives you the 6.2, what Steve taught me to say, efficiency factor, exactly how much CO2 per barrel that it takes in the Permian in terms of makeup. Out of that, we get the gas and the CO2 stream. We saw all of that on the tour yesterday into a plant. The plant is going to run the recycle back into the field, and by our calculation, total number on the total basin is about 2.7 BCF, 170 barrels a day. That gives us an efficiency factor on recycle of about 16. And Steve, I'm sure I'm saying all of that incorrectly, but get the general idea about how that we're looking at this balance. Also we heard a little bit today about the fact that one of the things that changes in the way we think about CO2, if we replace natural CO2 with anthropogenic, is we actually want to use more CO2 and not less. For the last 50 years, it's always been about using as less CO2 and making that efficiency factor as efficient as possible. But if what we're trying to do is actually get rid of CO2, we want to be as inefficient as possible. So that makes us think about lots of things differently than what we've thought about before. One of the factors that we have to know in order to understand, last piece, I forgot to say, and by the way, we need to sell the crude oil and the NGLs and gas, if there is any gas that we're not using for fuel. We need to sell all of those for hopefully more money than it costs us to do all the rest of that stuff, so the entire operation makes money. So, in order to understand how the economics of all of this works, you've got to know how much that it costs to get CO2 in that makeup slot in the first place. So, at least talking to all the folks that we did, we understand that there's a lot of numbers running around out there, but generally speaking, in the Permian, it's running around, it has run in the past around 2% of WTI crude oil. So in other words, I'm just going to take the price of WTI crude oil Cushing, multiply it by 2 cents, and that's going to give me the price of MCF of CO2. Quite different in the Gulf Coast market, by the way. And there's lots of contracts. Each one of these contracts are different. They're long term. But just to have a number to think about, that's what the curve would look like over the course of the last 10 years, 11 years. And there's only one line on there because the CO2 percentage, 2%, is a constant. So, we had really fabulous economics back during the days when crude oil was at $100. Then unattractive when things collapsed in 2014, 2015, back up in 2018 when prices improved, COVID crashed. Now we're back up into somewhere in the about 50, about 60 range or so now. So knowing that can at least let us start thinking about how we should look at the replacement of natural CO2 with anthropogenic CO2. A couple of speakers today talked about this concept, so I wanted to hit this first because I think a lot of folks are not getting this story very clearly as well. Again, I heard the presentations on these; they were great today, but I would guess that Mike, you would probably have a little difficult time with those statistics in Washington, D.C., getting people to pay a whole heck of a lot of attention to them. The guys at Denbury did a pretty decent job, I think, about figuring out how to get the communication across on this. So that's what I was going to use. I was going to use their slide to try to show you the way they think about carbon negative or at least carbon neutral crude oil. Again, Denbury, they have 925 miles of CO2 pipe on the Gulf Coast. They got the Jackson Dome producing facility. They plug in to 2 anthropogenic facilities, nutrient and air products in Louisiana and Texas. And then they got 16 oil fields. So here's the way they tell this story. Of course, for this to work, we got to be using anthropogenic CO2. So this doesn't apply to their Jackson Dome volumes. It only applies to the stuff that they get from natural sources. And to understand the math, we got to look at CO2 emissions per barrel of oil produced. The left scale is in pounds of CO2 per barrel. The right scale, which I like better, is in MCF per barrel of crude oil. Denbury carves up the emissions into their 3 scopes. So their scope 1 is about 70 pounds per barrel, and that's coming directly from their facilities. The scope 2 is about 90 pounds per barrel. Most of that is electricity for their field operations. And then all the way to scope 3, about 1,000 pounds per barrel of crude oil, and that includes scope 3 all the way from refining to distribution of the gasoline to cars using the gasoline. So add that together, that's everything theoretically that a barrel of Denbury crude oil generates. That's a total 1,160 pounds of CO2 that has to disappear someplace. The good news, at least for Denbury, is that it takes a lot more CO2 to produce a barrel of crude oil in Denbury's fields than it does in the Permian. Pretty much twice as much. So it's more like 12 MCF of CO2 per barrel versus the 6-ish number that we estimated a few minutes ago on the Permian. So the key takeaway here, I guess, is that, again, the more CO2 you use, the better off your economics are, not the other way around. So in Denbury's case, they estimate that they inject about 1,700 pounds of CO2 for each barrel of oil that they produce. That is less. That less the 1,600 CO2 emissions means that 540 pounds more CO2 is sequestered and emitted, and that's what gives them at least the bragging rights to say what they've got there is carbon negative crudes. Of course, there's always some opposing arguments to this, and that is probably the main one is double counting. Whoever captured that CO2 can't count those molecules, and then Denbury turn around and count them again. Well, there's some arguments on the other side of that equation too, and we heard some of them today. So I'm not going to get into that this evening, but nevertheless, it's still, I think, a very big deal, and Denbury has been able to, I think, sell this at least to some of the investment community. So where's all that anthropogenic CO2 is going to come from? We kind of saw a version of this today too. This is kind of where all the CO2 is coming from. It's a heat map of the EPA data. But you see that big old red spot down there? Everybody knows where that is. That's good old Houston, Texas, my home. The most CO2 polluting place in the United States. Those are all the facilities that are all along the ship channel. They are very concentrated. It's a fairly small piece of geography. Today it's about 60 million tons of CO2 on all those facilities that you're looking at there. So all we got to do is build that pipeline that I showed a few minutes ago, take this CO2 to the Permian Basin and replace the natural CO2 that's getting used right now. There's a couple of challenges in all of this. For one thing, we've got to capture the CO2 in the first place, and as we saw on a different version of this slide from somebody today, the CO2 capture process is not cheap. We're in striking distance with ammonia and ethanol and gas processing, not in striking distance for refineries and cement plants. Our numbers say we are in striking distance for ammonia, although it would be nice to be able to get the BBB kick in order to get the higher 45Q. Our sense is that that there is enough CO2 that could come out of the Permian or out of the ship channel in order to be able to meet the needs of 100% of the natural CO2 that is currently being used in the Permian today. So, somebody's got to build a pipeline. We thought the pipeline ought to look like that. It's coming from the ship channel into Denver City. Presumably that would exclude any anthropogenic CO2 that's already here, including Oxy's direct capture projects, direct air capture projects that are already here. We assume that the pipe would need to move in order to make this logically work about a BCF a day of CO2. Based on that, we think the pipeline ought to cost about $2 billion. We heard that in the infrastructure bill, there's some incentives to be able to get this to happen. We think the rate on that, by the way, if we were to build a BCF pipeline, would be about $1 an MCF. But if you build the pipeline higher, if the volume could be higher, or if you can just be, Steve, a little less efficient about use of CO2, you might be able to build a pipeline that's twice as big and get the rate down to half as much. I mean, it's not entirely linear, but you probably couldn't hit 50 cents, but you get close to it. So again, the deal structure then we think that could happen, and this is just one deal structure, nobody's going to like it, is that the pipe again would cost about $2 billion. The emitter is going to get the tax credit, but the Permian producers get their CO2 for free. Permian producers would eliminate the natural CO2 and replace it with Houston ship channel CO2, and there would have to be some sort of mechanism to balance out the value of the 45Q and who pays for the $1. But nevertheless, you can certainly make good arguments that somewhere between $5 and $10 could end up in the pocket of the Permian producer, depending on the way that the splits ultimately happen. So I'm not going to talk about all these numbers. The lowest case that we got is $44.35 net back improvement. But Steve, these guys are going to have these slides right so they can look at the numbers, so y'all can test my math and see if that will work. Well, there is another catch, and the other catch is that the two largest CO2 players, represented I'm sure here in this room, they're not necessarily paying retail because they own those those fields that are producing the CO2. So a lot would depend on how they value that CO2, how they look at transfer pricing, and that sort of thing. But the EOR, the credits for EOR are here. They can be able to be used if we just simply do that replacement exercise. And if it were to happen, there's, I think, you can build a case anyway where there's enough money to support capturing the CO2 from the ship channel, transporting it to the Permian on that pipeline, and replacing natural CO2 with it. So, anybody really going to build that pipeline? Well, as far as I know, nobody's announced it and nobody's trying to permit it. I might be wrong, but at least I don't know anything about it. We've talked to a number of midstream companies. They would jump at the chance to build that pipeline. But of course, there's one little catch, is they've got to get somebody to sign up for that capacity before they build it. But nevertheless, they would just jump at the chance to do it. So it's not obvious exactly how the deal structure might happen, but it's not impossible. And I think if we can get this kind of story and a lot of other stories out there too about how EOR can be used, we can get past this issue of there's no more U in CCUS. I just think that would be a bad thing. Thank you very much for staying away from the bar for the last 30 minutes. I believe you all did that. So it must be being polite for you, Steve. But we have questions, and we got nothing to do tonight besides answer questions and drink. So y'all prioritize.